take a huge pile of numbers from the real world. The populations of every country, the lengths of every river, the area of every lake, the line items in a company's accounts. Now throw away everything except the very first digit of each number, 1 through 9. 9 possible digits. You'd expect each of them to turn up about 11% of the time. That is not what happens. The digit 1 shows up about 30% of the time, and the digit 9 shows up less than 5. This isn't a quirk of one dataset. It happens almost everywhere. It has a precise mathematical reason, and it is so dependable that it has been used as evidence in criminal courtrooms. The first person to notice was the astronomer Simon Newcomb in 1881. Back then, if you needed a logarithm, you looked it up in a book of tables. And Newcomb noticed something odd about the library's copies. The early pages, the ones for numbers starting with 1, were filthy, worn and thumbed. The pages at the back, for numbers starting with 8 and 9, were nearly pristine. People were looking up numbers that began with 1 far more often than any other. Newcomb wrote it up, and the world completely ignored him for almost 60 years. Then, in 1938, a physicist called Frank Benford rediscovered the same thing, and this time he did the work. He collected 20,229 numbers from 20 different sources: river areas, populations, physical constants, molecular weights, death rates, street addresses of the men listed in American Men of Science. Numbers pulled at random out of an issue of Reader's Digest. Wildly unrelated data, all of it bent the same way. And so the pattern got named after the second person to find it. So why should the universe care what digit a number starts with? Here is the argument that cracks it open, and it is genuinely beautiful. Suppose there really is some universal law governing first digits. Then it has to work no matter what units you measure in. The lengths of rivers don't know whether you prefer miles or kilometers. Share prices don't care whether you count them in dollars or in yen. If you take every number in your data and multiply it by any constant you like, you have changed nothing about the world, only the ruler. So the pattern has to survive that. It has to be unchanged by multiplication. And here's the punchline. There is exactly one distribution of first digits that has that property, not several. 1. Roger Pinkham proved it in 1961. If a universal first-digit law exists at all, it has no choice but to be this one. And once you see it on a logarithmic scale, the whole thing becomes obvious. On an ordinary ruler, the distance from 1 to 2 is the same as from 8 to 9. On a logarithmic ruler, it isn't. The gap between 1 and 2 takes up about 30% of the whole stretch from 1 to 10. The gap between 9 and 10 takes up about 4.5%. Now think about what real quantities do. Populations don't grow by adding a fixed number each year. They grow by a percentage. So do prices and investments and bacteria in a dish. They move by multiplying. And a quantity that multiplies its way up a logarithmic ruler spends far longer crossing the wide gap at the bottom than the narrow one at the top. 30% of its life starting with a 1. Under 5% of it starting with a 9. The whole law is just that, written down. The probability of a leading digit d is the log of 1 plus 1 over d. Which brings us to the useful part. Humans are famously terrible at faking randomness. Ask someone to invent a page of plausible financial figures, and they'll spread the digits around far too evenly, because even numbers feels like what random ought to look like. Real accounts don't look like that. Real accounts obey Benford. The economist Hal Varian suggested using this to catch fudged data back in 1972. Decades later, the accountant Mark Nigrini turned it into a practical audit tool, and today testing the digits is a standard part of forensic accounting. It works on governments too. In 2011, a team of German researchers ran the test on the economic figures that every European Union member state had reported to Brussels. Of all the countries in the euro, the numbers that deviated most from Benford's law were the ones reported by Greece. In the United States, evidence built on Benford's law has been admitted in criminal cases at the federal, state, and local level. There's a lovely detail buried in the research, too. When people are asked to fabricate statistics, they now often get the first digits roughly right. because the law is famous enough to game, but they still get the second digits wrong.
Turn off the recorder.
Now, this is the part most explanations leave out, and it matters more than everything else so far. Benford's law is not a universal lie detector. It has strict conditions, and when they aren't met, it simply doesn't apply. The data has to spread across at least an order of magnitude, ideally several. So it works on populations, which run from hundreds to hundreds of millions. It fails completely on human height. Measure a crowd of adults in centimeters, and almost every single one of them starts with the digit 1, because human beings are all between about 150 and 199 centimeters tall. That's not a violation of the law. It's outside its jurisdiction. It also fails on numbers that were assigned rather than measured. Invoice numbers counting up from 1. Telephone numbers. Bank account numbers. And it fails on numbers that human psychology has already bent. A shop full of things priced at $9.99 is drowning in nines, and no fraud is involved. Which brings us to the most famous misuse of this idea. Every so often, someone runs a Benford test on election results, takes the vote counts from each individual precinct, looks at the leading digits, finds they don't match the curve, and announces that the numbers must have been faked. The problem is in the very first step. A precinct might report a few dozen votes. A big one might report a few thousand. That is barely one order of magnitude of spread. It is exactly the situation the law was never designed for, the statistical equivalent of measuring people's heights in centimeters. Walter Mebane, the political scientist who effectively invented the field of election forensics, and who does use digit tests in his own work, has said it about as plainly as it can be said. The first digits of precinct vote counts are not useful for diagnosing election fraud. And the lesson generalizes far beyond elections. When you run a statistical test on data it was never valid for, you don't get weak evidence. You get no evidence. The output looks exactly like a result. It just doesn't mean anything. So the digits are not telling you whether a number is true. They're telling you something about how it was made. Quantities that grew by multiplying leave one fingerprint. Quantities that were sprinkled onto a page by a human being leave a different one. And that difference is sitting there in plain sight, in the first digit of every number you've ever ignored.